Do you know what these are? I know what you're thinking. I'm only holding one thing, so I'm not saying it right because these implies it's plural. Well, indeed, I am holding only one thing, but what if I do this? Ah, now you can see that it is indeed these things. These are called nesting dolls. Most people think that they come from Russia, and in Russia they're called Matryoshka dolls. But oddly enough, they didn't actually originate in Russia. They actually originated in China. I know what you're thinking. What doesn't come from China? It seems like everything is made in China. There we go. Now, typically, these dolls look pretty much all the same. They all have the same look, but they might have something different about them, like different colors or that type of thing. But I couldn't resist getting these because if you'll notice, hopefully you can see all this. Oops. These are actually tell the story of Christ's birth. They're nativities. So we've got Mary, Joseph, a wise man, a shepherd, and of course, no nativity story is complete without baby Jesus. And so, something that you'll notice about these, again, I hope you can see these, is that even though they all look different, they all have the same theme, Christ's birth. Okay? So, you've read all 4 chapters of Ruth. And now you're probably, at least some of you, are probably thinking, okay, why, now that we finished the book of Ruth, do we need yet another Bible study lesson on Ruth when we've finished Ruth? Well, that's a good question. And here's the answer. We have spent the first week getting to know the background of Ruth. During the time of the judges, what the political situation was like, what the culture was like, what the religious heartbeat of the people was like, all of that, to get a better understanding of the time of Ruth and to understand why people did what they did and that type of thing. And then we spent 4 weeks, the last 4 weeks, digging into the intimate story of Ruth. And I do hope you guys were digging in that story. Have you ever heard the saying, not seeing the forest for the trees? Basically, it means that we're so busy focused on the details of something that we miss the overall situation. We miss the overall picture of the situation or of the picture. So we have just spent the last 5 weeks looking at the trees. Well, now it's time to step back and take a look at the forest, the bigger picture, the big doll, right, if you will. See, the Bible is the overarching, huge, large story of God's redemption of His wayward creation, because He loves His wayward creation. And the highlights of that story are, of course, the creation of mankind, the fall of mankind, the redemption of man through Messiah, and then eventually the gathering of God's people, or of all people really, and God's people going to be with God in eternity, and then the fate of those who do not know the Lord. Now, this is the big story, the meta-narrative, if you will. It's the overarching story, and it's like, you can think of it as like our largest nesting doll, Joseph. And here's the thing that I want to discuss this week. Not just the overarching story, but within this huge story of God's redemption of all mankind is a smaller story. A smaller story within the larger story. And that smaller story is the redemption of a people. God choosing a people. And the highlights of that would be the call of Abram, the exodus out of Egypt, the entering into the promised land, and a land, of course, the promised land being a land full of blessing and riches, where God's presence dwells with the people, and where God teaches his people how to be his people. Now again, within this smaller story, and we think of that story as our Mary nesting doll, and within this smaller story is yet another story. Actually, individual stories, smaller stories of faithfulness and faithlessness, of obedience and disobedience, of redemption and punishment, of those kinds of things. And they're stories of smaller stories that fit into the larger story. So we're talking about things like the stories of the disobedience of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. Think of Noah building the ark. Think of Jacob supplanting Esau. Think of other stories like Rahab, who hid the Israelite spies from her people. Think about the stories like the mighty Samson who judges his people, or even humble foreign widowers like Ruth. These are all smaller stories inside of the larger story of God's redemption of a people that is inside of a larger story, the largest story of God's redemption of mankind. And so that's why I have the nesting dolls, so hopefully give you an idea, like a visual idea of the stories within the stories, how they all fit together with one common theme of redemption. Now, Ruth's story is both a part of the larger story of God's redemption of a people and the largest story of God's redemption of all mankind. And here's the thing, everyone has their own story. I have my own story, you have your own story, and everyone's story fits inside the larger story of the redemption of God's people, right? The calling of a people, which fits inside the largest story, the redemption of all mankind. So as you go through this week's studies, think about these things. Maybe if it helps you to visualize the nesting dolls, then do that. But think about the fact that there are small stories within a larger story, within the largest of all stories, and they all have the same basic theme. Now, if you have any unanswered questions by the end of the week after the discussion, then please send those in and let me know so I can answer those questions for you. I will contact you with the answer to those questions. I hope and pray that you will truly be blessed by this final study on the book of Ruth. Oh, and one more thing. For this week, you are going to need a couple of items while you're studying. You're going to need a paper towel tube and a bathroom tissue tube. Okay? If you don't have the tubes, but you do have the paper towel and the bathroom tissue, just the tubes are still in it, don't worry about it. Okay? You can still, that's good. You can still use them. As long as you've got the tube. It doesn't matter if there's anything around it or not, as long as you have those tubes. So again, a paper towel tube and a bathroom tissue tube. So, with that in mind, thinking of the story within a story, like the nesting dolls, and having your bathroom tissue tube and your paper towel tissue tube at hand this week, happy studying.